Shalom Aleichem, Anna Rebecca Simon. Hello, my name is Rebecca Simon. On behalf of Shamira Media, I welcome our viewers. Our guest today is Miss Sabrina Bet-Masnour. Sabrina took up the Assyrian community across the world by storm when she, out of nowhere, appeared on a TED Talk talking about her newly found Assyrian identity. Sabrina was born in 2005. Yes, she is a teenager and still in high school. She was born in Paris, France, to an Assyrian father and a French mother. She has a 14-year-old brother. Sabrina comes from an iconic Assyrian family, as her grandfather, Dr. Wilson Bet-Masnour, was the Assyrian representative in Congress during the reign of Shah of Iran. We would like to show a part of her TED Talk at this time.
I am an Assyrian, a descendant of the Assyrian-Babylonian empires of Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. I am immensely proud of my heritage. So much of the world is focused on the today and now that the past is often ignored and forgotten. So today, I will talk to you about my Assyrian heritage, how and why I came to identify with it, and the importance of maintaining the continuity of the Assyrian nation. Until recently, to the oft-asked question of where are you from, I would reply, I am half American, half French. It was easy and simple, tying my identity to two defined, well-known countries and cultures. And yet, I knew that the truth of my heritage was far more layered. My father, my American half, who converses with me in English, speaks Assyrian with his parents and sister. It is otherwise known as Aramaic, an old Semitic language that Jesus spoke and in which the original Bible is written. Over the years, my grandparents would encourage me to learn Assyrian. As much as I loved them, and as important as I sensed it was for them, I did not learn Assyrian. Why should I have? I was, after all, half American, and English is the language of my American half. And they, my paternal family, speak perfect English. I did ask my father once or twice about Assyrians. My father would explain his heritage to me, but though interesting, it was not concrete. There is no country today that is called Assyria. I did not know other Assyrians. I would sporadically meet relatives, but they were not a part of my life. I did not eat Assyrian food. I did not know Assyrian music. I did not know Assyrian dances. Assyria was only an amorphous concept, and Assyrian was a vague heritage that was always in the background of my consciousness. It was not a heritage I identified with. Up until 8 months ago, when I lost my paternal grandparents to whom I was very close. What I did not know, and which I learned during their funeral services, and during research I did about their lives, was that my grandparents were prominent Assyrian leaders, activists, and nationalists. In learning about my grandparents, I resolved to learn more about Assyrians. And in learning about the past, I have learned about my present. Now, like my father and his parents, my Assyrian heritage informs my identity. To the oft-asked question of where are you from, I now say I am half Assyrian-American, half French.
Hello, Sabrina. Welcome. I know
Hello.
you're in London. Welcome to our program at Shamira Media.
Thank you for having me.
Sabrina, why TED Talk?
So we were given the opportunity at school to give a TED Talk last year. It was the second wave of TED Talks. There was one set of TED Talks the previous year. And I knew, since my grandmother had recently passed away, that I really wanted to do something where I could raise a platform and talk about this newly found identity, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the interview. So when I heard about the opportunity for the TED Talk a year before I actually did it, I immediately started writing it. And it took me a few weeks to write. And next thing you know, I was up on stage, and then it came out on YouTube, and I've had so many wonderful comments since. And yeah, I'm so happy with the outcome. So yeah.
Did you have to audition for the TED Talk or present
Yes.
your writing?
Yes, so we had to give a proposal form. There were about 10 of us who gave a TED Talk. So yes, we had to apply for it. And yes, so we were given a TED Talk supervisor, which was a history teacher and politics teacher at my school, who helped me quite a bit to kind of, structure my talk, since we were only allowed 10 minutes to talk. We weren't allowed to do more than that because of the license that our school has. So yeah.
So is this the international TED Talk or is it a European TED Talk? How does it work?
So TEDx is it's the organization, a part of TED. So TEDx is the independently organized TED Talk. So places like universities, some universities have licenses. My school has become a licensed TEDx platform. So we are allowed to kind of present TED Talks and spread them to the wider community. So yeah, it's a global thing, but so yeah, it's TEDx, which is, yes, global.
Did you present your Assyrian identity speech in front of an audience?
Yes, so I had my whole year group, which was about 75 girls. My family came. Eunice, my aunt, Dr. Wilson's daughter, came from New York to come watch me, along with her brother, my father, and my mother and my brother. We had some teachers watch and also some parents of the other girls giving TED Talks as well.
Excellent. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was
Thank
so
you.
heartwarming to
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear.
see you give a speech like that. Now, you were born and raised in Europe all your life.
Yes.
You lived in France, in England. You frequently and regularly visited the United States. But you were away from the general Assyrian community. And so, what was that one moment that you had the epiphany that there
Yeah.
was another side to you, that you have an incredible past that you didn't know about, and that you needed to go and discover a hidden part of you? When was that moment?
So I actually, when I was growing up, when I was very little, a child, I did not know what Assyria was. I knew that my family were from Iran. Assyria, I didn't know, again, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that Assyria and Iran were two different places, or, completely different communities. And at my grandfather's funeral service a few years ago in 2019, I was listening to the eulogies that were given by his patients, his good friends, our family. I was hearing about his life through these eulogies, and I had never heard of many of the things that the eulogies said. I didn't know them. I did not know that he was member of parliament in Iran. I did not know he spoke Turkish fluently. There were a lot of essential things that I didn't know. So, hearing these eulogies was definitely an uplifting experience and very enriching, knowing that my grandfather had such a big impact on a specific community. So I was 14 when my grandfather passed away. So again, I wasn't, it was kind of the age where I was beginning to mature quite a lot. And so I started doing my own research, asking my aunt and my dad about my grandfather and his past and what he was like. And, because my grandfather, he didn't speak very much about Assyrians. He would give me Assyrian lessons, actually, which I don't remember much from. But
And
yeah,
you
that
mean
was
the
my first
Assyrian
realization.
language? The Assyrian
Yes.
language lessons?
Yes, Assyrian language lessons. Yes. Um, yeah, it's a kind of short story. It was just my brother and I, when we would go to New York, we were always really jet lagged. And so we'd wake up at 5 in the morning, and we had never had anything to do. So my grandfather and my grandmother offered to give us Assyrian lessons. So yeah, that was kind of a big memory that I hold and cherish with myself, and I'll hold it forever. And I wish I could remember more, but learning Assyrian is definitely part of my goal, and helping bring back our nation. We have our nation, but obviously bring back our homeland in northern Iraq. But yeah, so my grandfather's funeral service was the original realization. Hearing all these wonderful people tell these stories about my grandfather and the impact that he had on the community. And then followed by that, a few years later, almost a year ago, was my grandmother's funeral service. So then again, I heard stories about my grandmother, her working with my grandfather and being a wife to my grandfather, and a mother of two children, Assyrian children, and me being the granddaughter, also being Assyrian. So that also helped me to kind of realize that there was a community, there was something that I was part of that I was unaware of, and that seemed so special. And between the funeral of my grandfather and my grandmother, was I went to a wedding in California of a dear cousin of ours, who, it was an Assyrian wedding, and there were all these Assyrian dances, all this wonderful food, people coming together, speaking the language, having just such a wonderful time together. And that was also a moment where I kind of realized, like, it's such a shame that I haven't, you know, researched, or I mean, I was still young, but that I didn't know very much about it. So that's kind of when I started doing my own research, researching my grandparents' lives, learning about Assyria in general, talking to my aunt more about Assyria. And yeah, that was my kind of other moment of realization. It was my grandparents' funeral and the wedding. I knew that it was such a special community that I was missing out on, and it was, it's not a community that you don't find people from there every day. So yeah.
It's ironic that their end, your grandparents' end of life, started a new beginning in you. It's
Right.
very ironic. Why do
Right.
you suppose that your family, be it your grandparents, your aunt, your father, really didn't have an Assyrian conversation with you growing up? Why do you suppose that is?
Honestly, I'm not too sure, because Assyrian was not a language that was spoken too frequently at home. My parents speak either French or English to each other, because obviously my mother does not speak Assyrian or Farsi. But so my father would only speak Assyrian with Eunice, my aunt, and my grandparents, Wilson and Nora. So I think it was originally because they didn't want too many languages to be spoken in the house, and for us to kind of get lost in the languages, which was actually a funny story, that my brother didn't speak until he was 2.5, because we had so many languages in the house. And but honestly, I don't know why my grandparents or parents didn't bring it up earlier. They might have, sprung it here and there, but there weren't many occasions where I was spoken to about my Assyrian heritage until my grandparents passed away. I was also a young child who, I didn't. It's not that I didn't care, obviously, but it's that I had interest in other things, playing with dolls and American Girl dolls that my grandmother would buy me. But yeah, I think when I was 14, I realized that there was a community that I was really missing out on and that I was a part of. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know why they didn't bring it up earlier. I'm guessing it was just because we were young children and probably wouldn't understand. Yeah.
Have you since talked to your aunt Eunice or your father Raman about why?
So we haven't spoken much about why, but I have read. So my father, he went to Johns Hopkins University, and he showed me, his application letter, and it was a full, script about his Assyrian heritage. And I told him, Dad, why didn't you show me this earlier? And he was like, well, you wouldn't really understand. I mean, honestly, even at this age, I'm not an expert at all about Assyria. It's only been a few months since I've done in-depth research about it. Um, so yeah, I have had a lot of conversations with my aunt Eunice, not necessarily about why it wasn't fully introduced earlier in my life, um, but more so about my grandfather and my grandmother and my aunt telling me stories about, and my dad as well, about how they had to leave Iran during the revolution, and how closely they identify with their Assyrian heritage, and how proud they are that they're my father's, obviously I'm his daughter, and how proud he is that his daughter also identifies with it.
Having grown up in France and England, the two places with the best Assyrian artifacts in their museums, the Louvre and the British Museum. Do you recall ever looking at the Assyrian exhibits prior to your realization of your Assyrian culture?
Yes, so we went to the Assyrian exhibit several years ago, which I need to go back to because I have not gone back since I had the realization. I think that's kind of when my dad, especially, I went with my mother, my father, and my brother, who is now 14. So at the time, I was probably 12 or 13, and my brother was probably 9 or 10. So honestly, I really don't remember very much from that experience at the British Museum. But my dad and I will be booking tickets very soon because I remember walking through the halls. I don't remember much from the paintings, the artifacts that we saw, but I think that's when my father started wanting to introduce our heritage to us and how important it was to him.
I promise you it will be a different experience for you, much more
Yes,
meaningful than before. First of all, you're more
definitely.
mature now. Secondly, you can relate to those exhibits. Now that you are starting to immerse yourself in the Assyrian culture, I don't know to what extent food, but Assyrian culture, language, and community, do you feel any different inside? I mean, I've always been an Assyrian, whether I lived in Iran and in the United States or anywhere. I'm through and through Assyrian, a nationalist. But for somebody who has jumped over from one side to the other and has discovered their new them, does it feel any different inside of you now that you have a new connection to your Assyrian heritage?
Yes, I feel like a different person. I feel like there's a sense of belonging that I have that I always felt like I had a sense of belonging in my family and my French community and my, American community since I spent so much time there. But I think since identifying with this heritage, I mean, I think it's really changed me. I mean, firstly in San Francisco, it was we went to this wedding. It was shortly after my grandfather had passed away. And I went to this wedding and not knowing anyone except for my mother, my father, and my brother. My father didn't attend the celebration, but he was at the church service. But anyway, I went to this wedding, and everybody knew who I was. Everybody was like, "Oh, you're Dr. Wilson's granddaughter," and and I just felt like I felt different immediately. And I went through a difficult past with mental health, which is now in my past. But I think my Assyrian heritage has kind of helped me come out of that and feel like I have a very strong sense of purpose because the Assyrian community is, a lot of Assyrians live in diaspora and are no longer living in our homeland. So I think, with that, it's a real community that I've really never seen before. And there's something, after even giving this TED talk, I feel more, enlightened, and I feel like I have more of a platform to talk about this new experience that I've had and how it really changed me.
Incredible, the kind of impact it's had on you. What do your parents or your brother think about this new you?
I mean, my parents are definitely proud of me, especially my father, who probably wasn't expecting such a big change so quickly. My brother as well. He's 14, so he's at the age where I was when my grandfather passed away, and when I had this kind of realization that I'm part of this community that I didn't really know about. So I think my brother is, he's kind of starting to do his own research, and I'm starting to kind of teach him. And I mean, it's not obviously I'm not an expert, but I can at least give him some baseline about what my grandfather would do for the Assyrians and how much impact he had, and how he was one of the strongest activists. Um, so yeah, definitely. I mean, everyone is so supportive of me, obviously, and yeah, it's wonderful to see all the support and all the encouraging comments that I've had.
Well, I'll tell you something if you already don't know. We Assyrians are hot and emotional. Um, that's what's
Yes, I've
different from
noticed.
the European or even American
Definitely. I
culture.
think that's what makes
We're
it so special.
hot.
Yeah, that's what makes it so special. It's the heat and the kind of the difference and the how, you know, alive everyone is.
And you are drawn to that, huh?
Yes, definitely. I've always been an extrovert and always loved public speaking and always, want to do things for the things I love and for the people I love. And, identifying with the Assyrian heritage is a big part of who I am now. So,
Well, I'm not sure if your parents have given you the right date on your birth certificate. You sound so much more mature than a 17-year-old. And that speaks
yeah.
volumes about you. Now, I know you have aspirations, you have your life planned, you have goals. Please tell us after you finish high school in England, what are your plans for your life?
So I'm currently doing my A levels at a British school in central London. So I'm currently applying to the US. I'm in the college application process, and so I'm hoping to go to university in the US next year, which will kind of be the start of something new. Another big change in my life is going to come. And so I'd really like to study anthropology, which is ties to cultures. And, obviously identifying with this heritage has not only allowed me to become more enlightened about my own Assyrian heritage and community, but to learn about wider cultures and other various cultures in the world. So I'd really like to study anthropology, perhaps move on to law or journalism, which is something my aunt thinks I would be good at. So yeah, I definitely like to move in that direction first and foremost, and of course, alongside that, first and foremost as well, learning the Assyrian language is definitely a big part of my aim. It's going to help me connect to Assyrians, especially when it comes to communicating to people with people in who live in our homeland in northern Iraq. And I have big aspirations in terms of following in my grandparents' footsteps. Obviously, they did a lot for the Assyrian community, but they didn't manage to recreate the Assyrian homeland. So obviously, that is at the forefront alongside education and education of Assyrians in general. Whether it's education of our heritage, like people like me who don't necessarily identify with it and don't know much about it can learn more about it through education. So that's the kind of first fold, and then the second fold is obviously having PhDs, doctorates, things like that for Assyrians to kind of because education is such a big part of a lot of people. So yeah, but um, for myself in the future, being I've always loved sport. I was a big sports person when I was younger. I used to be a swimmer, and I definitely want to create Assyrian groups, whether in diaspora or in our homeland. It's obviously easier for me to speak for people living in diaspora, but creating sports teams, and obviously there's the football team Assyriska in Sweden. So kind of following in those footsteps and creating my own sports teams and communities, whether that be tennis, swimming, running, whatever that be, but just for a way for the Assyrian people to come together. And ultimately, I mean, I would love to do some sort of football match in our homeland and for everyone to kind of come together in our homeland. But obviously, that's very difficult for everyone. So yeah, I mean, I have a few ideas like that, but ultimately, I mean, rebuilding our homeland in northern Iraq is something is, I mean, obviously would be the dream, um, but time will tell.
Well, you have plenty of time, my dear, to fulfill your dreams. You're only a budding Assyrian, and you have the rest of your life to work towards your goals. You do come from a pedigree of very, very educated an accomplished family. Tell us something about your grandmother's education, Dr. Bet-Masnour's wife, that grandmother. And Dr. Bet-Masnour was a medical doctor. Now, give us a little known fact about your grandmother's education.
So my grandmother, the fun fact is that my grandmother was the first female Assyrian doctor and one of the first female doctors in the Middle East. So that is something that I'm very proud to say of my grandmother. She was such a wonderful lady, so poised and elegant. But that's probably the biggest fact. She really had to fight to get into medical school, and being a woman working in medicine was very difficult at the time. There were people who didn't believe in her, but ultimately, I mean, she was did pediatrics, so I mean, she had a huge impact on so many people's lives. At her funeral service, there were her own patients speaking about her. And I think that's such a wonderful thing. So.
She was a pediatrician, and what was the specialty of your grandfather's?
So my grandfather was a gynecologist.
Now, your father is also a very educated man. He's an attorney by profession, and he went to some Ivy League schools, which are?
He did his undergraduate degree and master's at Johns Hopkins University. He studied political science and then I think international studies for his master's, and then he went to Columbia for law school.
And your Aunt Eunice, in her own right, she's also very educated. She's also gone to some top-rated universities, which are?
Right. So she went to Yale for her undergraduate studies, and then she went to NYU for her master's, and then to Cambridge for her postgraduate in finance.
So you have, I think you have the right genes, right smart genes. You have the passion, you have the heat, and you have the goal. I don't see why you can't make it and pursue your goals and make something happen. And as you mature and become older, your goals become bigger and you will accomplish more. And we can't wait to hear great news from you. Now we're going to take a small break for our sponsors, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about your grandfather. Stay tuned.
Shalom Aleichem. Ani even Anokin Verani. Vitam b'chaya gitarlak qametchet estrishene, ubishene etli nesyana b'zmenta zabantet betfate. In techmunitun zonitun uzabnitun betfatu mulkane, Gu California, prishait mdita turlak l'chadarvano, rabba betchedian oyan hayran taqatochun. من بسمعلكم قريمون لي التري سيبر أوتشا إشتا أربعة ثمانية سيبر إشتا.
Assyrian Foundation of America was established in 1964 as a 501c3 nonprofit in California to help needy Assyrians around the world support Assyrian education and preserve and promote the Assyrian language and culture. Since 1977, Nimbe magazine has been published under the auspices of the Assyrian Foundation of America and distributed around the world. Every day since inception, Assyrian Foundation of America has been a window of hope to keep Assyria alive. For more info, please visit AssyrianFoundation.org.
إيمانوايلا accident اتنرابا ناشا ليعطي متبصل طاقة شكلي. اتلانسيانة بدنا cases ات injury law. و بيالباية قريمخ. إن آتن ينكل بتت بيتا خزموخن يطانة اتلوخن بوقارة مخبرون المنيان التلفون 8 أربع شوا وشو 8 تري وشو 5 خا إشتا يعني توكن بيت injuryrights.com. شمي إلى توني كالغراكس كيام زمن لشان خلية يما.
Hello, welcome back, our audience. We're having a conversation with Ms. Sabrina Bet-Masnour about her Assyrian identity, her life, her goals, her aspirations. Now, your grandfather, I have to tell you a little story about my first, or perhaps the only encounter with your grandfather when I was a child in elementary school. That may or may not interest you, but I just want to share it with you and with our audience.
Please do.
I believe, in one of the events that our Assyrian elementary school in Tehran had. And we were told that Dr. Bet-Masnour will come. And we were very excited. I believe he lined up. And I saw him walking towards us. I believe he had fair skin, light eyes and light hair. He walked in, of course, as a child, everybody looks tall, and he looked very tall to me. And the way he walked was very assured. He had a faint smile on his face, and I knew he was a powerful man. We were told that. And I wanted to grab his attention internally. I didn't do anything externally. But it was like, me, look at me, this powerful man, just look at this little child. He didn't, of course, because there were hundreds of other students lined up to greet him. But what I took away from that encounter up to today was a powerful man, but there was certain enigma about him. So that has stayed with me. And whenever I think about him, I think about this enigmatic man, very well dressed with his iconic bow tie, very Westernly dressed, which was unlike the rest of most of the Assyrians. So that is my experience with your grandfather. I don't think I ever met him again, but that vision has never left me. Now, with that, if a child my age, that I'm at this age now, but as a child, I remembered him and he influenced me. He has influenced many other Assyrians. And we didn't hear from him after he left Iran, not as much. Please tell us what his later years were like.
Yes. So my grandfather retired at the age of 85 in 2013. He went back to the United States to stay with his wife, Dr. Rebecca, otherwise known as Nora, and his two children. So he was 85 when he retired, and he just had the typical illnesses of an elderly person. He passed away, he was 92. So for the last 7 years of his life, he was kind of, slowing down and nothing major. He kind of just, he was such a wonderful man. But I think, he came back obviously he was 85 and he hadn't, achieved the goal that he had to, reshape the Assyrian homeland and have it again in northern Mesopotamia. But at the end of the day, his country, his nation was proud of him. And he came back to the US and retired. And he just had the illnesses of any other elderly person, and he slowed down. He lived at home. He was quite quiet. He was always, no matter what, even if he stayed at home the whole day, he always had his bow tie on, always ready to go.
So he stayed in Iran after the revolution and practiced gynecology. Is that right?
I'll say the kind of story. So during the revolution, after the revolution, 1979, he was imprisoned because of his political activities under the Shah's regime. He was actually saved from prison by Khomeini's right-hand aide, who was actually the patient of my grandmother, and nobody knew about this. So he got my grandfather out of prison, and no one knew about it until much later. So after his release from prison, he was not allowed back in Iran. He didn't have a passport for about 2 years until they exonerated him fully by Khomeini's regime. And so my grandfather then rejoined his family in the U.S. in in 1979, and then he went back to Iran in the mid 1980s because of the Iraq War. The Khomeini's government wanted to attract all the doctors who had left back to Iran and announced that the country needed doctors and that it was safe for them to return to Iran. So my grandfather took that risk. He decided to move back. It was difficult for women, especially women doctors, to go back to Iran because they had, unfortunately, less powers. So my grandmother stayed in New York. She continued her advisory work in pediatrics with various organizations, and then my grandfather went back to Iran in 1985 or 86 until 2013, when he was 85. He continued his medical surgical practices until he was 85. So, yeah.
Unbelievable. I didn't know this story. I didn't know he went back. So what kind of a man would you say he was? I mean, you were very young as a child. Probably your assessments are different than if you had seen him now, you would have different assessment. But from a child's eye, what kind of a man was he?
Oh God, I admired my grandfather so much. I mean, as I said before, he was a man that, he would wake up in the morning early, bright and early. He would, always wear his bow tie, always very poised, and he always wanted to present himself well. He was quite quiet. I knew he loved me and my brother very much. He always had this saying. He would say, "Smart, darling, beautiful Sabrina," that in that order. That was kind of his line. And looking back, I mean, I realized that it made such a big impact on my life. I think, in his later years, obviously he was more quiet and had the typical elderly person's illness, but we never had, I don't remember at least having a long, conversation, but I remember all the meaningful times that he said, "Smart, darling, beautiful Sabrina," in that order, almost every day to me, whether I was happy or sad, whenever. And so, yeah, that really empowered me and made me feel like I belonged, and that I was loved, even though, even though we didn't speak that much, number one, because he was quite elderly, and from the years that I can remember, and number two, that we didn't go to New York that often because we lived halfway across the world. So.
Do you remember one small story he told you? It could be insignificant to you, but for the rest of the audience, it could have a lot of significance. One small story he told you, or a small incident that touched you and you remember it.
So I don't remember very much of his stories from when he was, living in Iran or practicing medicine in Iran. But, there were a few memories that I had with him. Obviously, the one I just told you, the one about, my grandfather giving us Assyrian lessons in the morning. He would take us, he would, in the snowy New York, he would take us down to Dunkin' Donuts and get us 6 donuts for my brother and I at 6 in the morning. And then come back and we'd eat our donuts, and he'd teach us Assyrian. He'd write down everything. Obviously, I couldn't read very well. He always read his newspapers in the morning. I mean, that was a staple that he couldn't go a day without reading the newspaper. So, there were little things like that I remember here and there. But there was also actually my grandmother, my grandfather, and I used to go to the Plaza Hotel a lot in New York. the Plaza Champagne bar was our favorite place to hang out. Obviously, I could not and still cannot drink alcohol, but but my grandfather would have his Bloody Marys, and my grandmother her vodka limes, and I would sit there with my Shirley Temple. And I just remember that we had the most wonderful conversations, whether it was from, boy crushes or, life stories about my grandmother and her craziness. But yeah, those were my main memories from, spending time with my grandfather in New York, and him coming back to Paris a few times for Christmas. So yeah.
Did you converse in English, I presume?
Yes, we converse in English.
How did your grandparents meet? Do you know?
Oh, I actually don't know. That's a good question.
You
I
have
really
a
don't know.
homework to do.
Yes, I do.
Medical
I
school,
assume
perhaps?
actually,
I don't know.
I know they were very young when they got married. I'm not sure the exact age, but they were in their early 20s. So I assume they met at medical school, but that will be my homework.
If you could, what would you tell or ask each one of your grandparents, your grandmother and your grandfather, now that they're gone?
My grandfather, I would ask him, on an Assyrian level, and on the, talking about his aims and goals as a strong, leader and Assyrian activist and nationalist. I would ask him probably why he became such a why, first of all, he became a member of parliament, why he was so involved, and being involved in a war is a life-threatening experience. People who are so passionate about their country and their nation, their culture, whatever it may be, they do it. But my grandfather did it for until he was 85. So first I would ask him, how do you do that until the age of 85? And also, what kind of started what ignited his passion for, wanting to kind of save the Assyrian nation and get our homeland back. And my grandmother, I would ask her, my grandmother was so powerful in the sense that she was a bit like my hero. She was so powerful in the sense that she had a tough time going to medical school. I mean, she, before she went, it was very difficult because obviously she didn't know if she was going to get in as a woman who wanted to practice medicine. So I would ask her, how did you get through that courage? Obviously, we live in a time now, we're luckier to live in a time where, there's pay is more equal between men and women and things like that, and it's relatively equal in certain industries, in certain professional industries. But I would ask her, how did she kind of keep that grit and determination within her when she knew it was so hard to earn a certain level degree and become a doctor as a female.
Okay. You are among many thousands of children born in diaspora, either fully Assyrian or half Assyrian, quarter Assyrian, partially Assyrian, who do not speak the language. And it is the young people who carry the language to the next generation. And I believe, as a nationalist, that we do need a renaissance for the Assyrian language. And I'm sure you agree with me. What is the advice that you would give the teens and their parents as it relates to our language?
So I think, especially with minorities. So when I was younger, my first language was French and English, both together. Their languages, they're both unique cultures, but they're languages that a lot of people speak, and they're often taught in schools. But languages like Assyrian or Aramaic, they're not taught in schools. and most minority languages are not taught in schools. So I think it's definitely important for minority communities to be taught their languages from birth. I think, if a family is half English, half Assyrian, they should both be taught. It should not just be English, for example. Obviously, it's helpful to know English because English is a globally spoken language. But I think it's definitely important for the first languages to come from your identity and your background. So essentially, Assyrian needs to be incorporated immediately. What I think, I wish it was incorporated into my life immediately. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and I understand why in some sense. But it's harder to learn Assyrian, as I'm still young, so I have time and I can learn it, and it's definitely one of my main goals is to learn the language. But I think going to, like, for example, my Aunt Eunice, she went to Chinese classes. When she was 40, 50, she was in Chinese class because she loved the language. And I think that's important for Assyrians to do, especially if that's a heritage that they identify with, or making sure they take time out of their day to speak about to learn Assyrian. So yeah, I think creating groups or attending classes is something that is definitely essential. But to parents, I think I'm not a parent myself, obviously, but as a parent, hopefully in the future, I would definitely Assyrian, if I know the language by then, or even if I don't, I would definitely like to incorporate it from the beginning.
I'm so proud of you. All it needs is parents' determination. It's not that hard. Kids pick up the language in no time.
Right. I mean, it's so quick.
Everything in no time.
Right.
It's the parents' determination that decides whether they speak the language or not.
Right.
At the end of our conversation, Sabrina Bet-Masnour, there are a lot of people who say we've had martyrs all throughout history, going back centuries ago. And we still don't have a country. Our numbers are dwindling. Our language is about to die. We are in diaspora. And so what was the purpose of the martyrs? You are the result of all those bloodsheds, because they shed their bloods, so there's still going to be Assyrians left in the world, no matter how small of a population. So you can pick up the pieces and go on and make something out of our nation. And I thank you for coming back to us. You have no idea how much personally and deeply it means to me. And I thank you, and I wish you all the best. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, out of your studies. You went to school this morning, and in the afternoon, early evening, you sat down and talked to us. And I cannot thank you enough. And thank to Laurence, your mom, and Raman. Like, I can franchise his name, Raman. But Raman is the Assyrian way of saying it, for raising such a beautiful young lady. We're so proud of you. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here. I mean, it's a big opportunity for me as well to kind of raise my platform and talk about and raise awareness and, talk about the aspirations that I have for our nation. So, I think it's definitely a big step forward, and thank you very much for having me. And, I'm a proud Assyrian. I'm very proud to be Assyrian.
You don't understand this, ask your Aunt Eunice or your dad Raman to translate it for you. And best wishes to you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
أبيتم بسيمة مغبا جشخانة يداء شميران اتلن شهارة قد اتلن أتخيال بنات جيلة قد خبخا بدارنا الله خب مغزوينا قدو سامت سورايز قد جابئتن بسيمة رابا بوشم شيء